Hello everyone, LaFinchy here. Today, we'll explore a timeline where Pasquale Paoli's Corsican Republic survived into the modern day. In our timeline, Corsica made around 3 attempts to assert its independence from the Genoese Republic. The most successful was from 1755 to 1768, when Pasquale Paoli and his forces drove out the Genoese and established a parliamentary constitutional republic modeling many Enlightenment ideals. However, since the republic was largely unrecognized, Genoa decided to sell the island to France in 1768, where the island would remain largely under French rule into the present day. In this timeline, Paoli beseeches the assistance of the United Kingdom in order to reinforce their sovereignty from Genoa, and thus get recognized on the international stage. In exchange for military protection and economic assistance, Corsica would come under the suzerainty of the United Kingdom, maintaining their democratic rule while recognizing King George II as the de jure head of state. The United Kingdom would benefit greatly from maintaining Corsica as a strategic Mediterranean base to bolster their power in the Mediterranean region against France, akin to the British possessions of Gibraltar, Malta, and Cyprus. This actually happened later in the 18th century, when Paoli broke off from the French Republic in 1794 and requested the assistance of the United Kingdom to protect the new state as a dominion of the British Empire. Although it only lasted 2 years, it would be very possible for Corsica to come under British suzerainty in the 1750s, with Pasquale Paoli acting as Prime Minister, beholden to George II through a Viceroy or Governor General. This alone wouldn't be that significant, but in 1769, Napoleon Bonaparte would be born inside an independent Corsica to relatively minor nobility. However, in this timeline, since he wasn't born inside France, Napoleon wouldn't have gotten into French military school and would have never come to power in France. The absence of Napoleon in modern European politics would have profound effects on its history. By the late 1790s, France, despite having won the War of the First Coalition, was in an extremely vulnerable state. After Robespierre's reign of terror, the Directory became riddled with corruption and was generally unpopular and ineffective in bringing stability between the Republican and Royalist citizens of the nation. In our timeline, Napoleon's seizure of power, although a compromise on French republicanism, centralized the French state to the point where they could afford to go on the offensive. Without Napoleon, however, it is possible that tensions between the Republicans and Royalists would boil over into civil war, like what happened in the War of the Vendée, leaving the Republic defenseless against future coalitions. Without Napoleon's contributions towards the success of the Italian campaigns, it is even possible that the First Coalition could have defeated France within the mid-1790s, with Corsica being used as a base to support British troops in the Battle of Toulon, leading to Royalist victory in the city and gaining a foothold in Provence. Either way, the Bourbon French monarchy would be restored under either Louis XVII or Louis XVIII, along with minor land concessions. Though the monarchy would be restored, it is unlikely that a complete return to ancien regime governments would be possible. By 1800, the Enlightenment had already propagated greatly amongst the European intelligentsia, with many of its principles such as the separation of church and state, and emphasis on liberty being implemented in Corsica. This, along with a large amount of the French populace supporting at least some revolutionary ideals, would lead to France becoming a semi-constitutional or constitutional monarchy like the Bourbon restoration of our timeline. As revolutionary ideals wouldn't be spread by force throughout Europe like what Napoleon did, democratic and liberal governance would definitely emerge more slowly, with regions like Germany, Italy, and Scandinavia more likely to liberalize with pressure from the intelligentsia and working classes, and nations like Russia likely maintaining autocratic rule. Constitutional and semi-constitutional monarchies would likely be the predominant system of governance in Europe today, with fewer republics such as the Netherlands, Switzerland, and Venice. The Dutch Republic, without having been successfully invaded without Napoleon, would have remained, with the orange-held position of stadtholder being relegated as a more ceremonial role and more power being given to the Parliament of the United Provinces. This would also mean that the Dutch would retain control over several important colonies such as Ceylon, the Cape Colony, and Essequibo, increasing the Dutch Empire's relevance into the 19th century. Without British settlement and the subsequent Great Trek of Boer settlers inland, the Cape Colony would expand more slowly and mainly be relegated to the Cape region, acting as a supply port for ships sailing from Europe to Asia. Perhaps the Dutch colony could expand and dispute with another colonial power like Portugal or Britain over the Highveld or Transvaal area, with an independent Zulu or Xhosa nation gaming colonial politics to maintain autonomous rule, like with Lesotho or Swaziland, or even resist colonization, like with Ethiopia. Ceylon would be one of the Dutch Republic's most prized possessions as a foothold in South Asia, providing the Netherlands with lucrative spices like cinnamon and acting as a link between the Cape Colony and the Dutch East Indies. The East Indies would still likely be able to gain hegemony of the Nusantara region, with Malacca still in Dutch hands. The region of Malaya would remain contentious between Britain and the Netherlands, with each power trying to vie for influence between the various Malayan sultanates. Without Napoleon, Spain and Portugal would never have come under Napoleonic rule. This would have major effects on the history of the Hispanic world, as dissatisfaction with the rule of Joseph Bonaparte would be a major factor in the Latin American revolutions of the early 19th century. Spain would likely be able to hold onto their Latin American holdings until around the late 19th century, with some colonies gaining independence through peaceful means, leading Spain to become a much more powerful and relevant power in the 19th and 20th centuries. The reduced amount of revolutions would likely lead to a more politically stable and thus economically and geopolitically richer Latin America. Portugal also wouldn't have had to relocate their court to Brazil, meaning that it would remain as a colony under Portugal. During the 19th century, there would eventually be a widespread movement to achieve independence from Portugal, possibly through a revolution. Since there wouldn't be a central authority such as the Brazilian king to maintain the territorial integrity of the nation, Brazil would split into various republics, mainly based around the original colonies of the eastern seaboard. The prevention of the collapse of the Iberian empires would drastically change the history of the United States. Without Napoleon, the Louisiana Purchase wouldn't have been possible, making expansion harder for the young republic. As the doctrine of manifest destiny simmered further through the 19th century, relations between the United States and the Spanish Empire would grow more tenuous, as wars are likely to occur over key areas like Louisiana and Texas. It is possible that America could provide funding to Latino separatist movements to destabilize Spain in order to expand further, but ultimately, this would likely lead to a smaller America. One major consequence of the Napoleonic Wars was the rise of nationalism in the 19th century, especially in Italy and Germany. As Napoleon invaded and reorganized the smaller states of these regions into more streamlined entities, notions of the German and Italian peoples comprising a singular nation that ought to unify under one state were inherited from France and spread quickly amongst Europe, especially among ethnic groups subject under large multi-ethnic empires of the East, Russia, Austria, and the Ottomans. Thus, nationalism would become the driving force of most events in modern European history. Without Napoleon's nation-building in France, nationalism as we know it wouldn't have arisen, changing the trajectory of European history. In Germany, the Holy Roman Empire under Austria would have remained, with the empire remaining largely stable aside from competition with Prussia. I find it likely that with increasing pressure from liberal uprisings, the empire could centralize and eventually unite into a unified German empire under the Habsburg crown, with most of the princes retaining their land. Having the nobility give up their titles without force would be a little implausible. However, it is possible that Prussia could challenge Austria's place within Germany and create a more unitary German state in the north. Either way, Germany in this timeline would be far less united, with regional identities taking more precedent. This would also be the same for Italy to an extent. Notions of an Italian nation have slightly older roots in the Renaissance, with thinkers like Pasquale Paoli himself being advocates for 18th century Italian nationalism. I can see this manifesting into a republican revolt in Austrian Milan, as the emperor focuses more on German matters, stressing the need of Italian sovereignty from the French, Austrians, and Spanish. This could potentially lead to conflict with Sardinia-Piedmont, as they vie for dominance over northern Italy under either republican or monarchical governance. This could see a coalition of the republics of Milan, Corsica, Genoa, and Switzerland — in this timeline Swiss neutrality is never officially recognized — defeating the Savoyard monarchy and exiling them to Sardinia. I can see Milan and Genoa uniting afterwards to form a unified Italian republic called Lombardy, presenting itself as a successor to the republican traditions of the Lombard Leagues. It is also likely that Lombardy could absorb other North Italian regions such as Emilia, Tuscany, and potentially Veneto. However, this Italian nation likely wouldn't be able to unite the entire peninsula, with resistance from both the two Sicilies and the Papal State, hesitant to adopt a more republican government. Without the Napoleonic Wars, Venice maintains their independence and likely wouldn't be keen on joining Lombardy due to their historic rivalries with both Milan and Genoa, and would instead opt to build a separate Venetian identity among its populace. I can see Lombardy possibly annexing Bergamo and Brescia from Venice under the justification of uniting Lombard speakers in the area. Either way, without the unification of Italy or a Prussia-led Germany, the world wars as we know them wouldn't have arisen, leaving 20th century European history largely unrecognizable. Going back to Corsica, Paoli's leadership would have a large impact in the application of Italian nationalism, such as the adoption of Tuscan as an official language and lingua franca across Italy due to its literary tradition. Possible expansion into mainland Italy through the acquisition of minor states like Piombino, backed by Britain to reinforce their position in the Mediterranean. This could also motivate a potential Corsican invasion of Sardinia as a part of the feud between Sardinia, Piedmont, and Milan, in an expression of a sort of Corsican nationalism, seeing the Cesares and Gallurese people of northern Sardinia as Corsicans to be united to Corsica proper. Sardinia could be used as an official springboard for Corsica to eventually unite other parts of Italy under British suzerainty. However, this would be very unlikely, as Corsica likely wouldn't be able to pull off an amphibious invasion of the Apennine Peninsula, thus making it too big of a risk for Britain to sign off. Although nationalism wouldn't be nearly as prevalent without its spread by Napoleon, it could gain traction in Eastern Europe, where nations like Poland and Serbia already had distinct identities from their subjugators, as well as, in Serbia's case, revolting multiple times before the Napoleonic Wars. The Ottoman Empire in Europe would still collapse in favor of new Balkan ethno-states. Some, like Serbia or Greece, could come into conflict with Venice in order to confiscate their Adriatic possessions of the Ionian Islands and Dalmatia. However, Venice does have a good chance of defending themselves against these new powers and possibly promote a pan-Venetian identity among its overseas lands, and Ragusa, likely to be heavily influenced by Venice. Austria would likely have some issues regarding secessionist movements in Bohemia, Hungary, Poland, and Croatia, especially if Austria decides to move towards German unification within the Holy Roman Empire. In the event that Austria decides to unify with the German world, Hungary, Galicia, and possibly Bohemia, but more unlikely, would definitely leave the empire, with Hungary dealing with their own ethnic divisions regarding Transylvania, Slovakia, and Croatia, and likely allying with the Galician Polish state, at the expense of relations with Prussia and Russia. A similar situation could arise within the Russian Empire. However, these separatist movements would likely have a lesser chance of success than their Austrian and Ottoman counterparts. Other than Corsican sovereignty and greater prestige of Corsica in this timeline, the general Corsican economy would remain quite similar, with the agricultural and mining goods industries making up a major part of the Corsican economy. A large tourism industry would also grow in the late 20th century, as it has the potential to become a cheap tourist destination for British tourists, even after its independence from the British Empire in the mid-20th century. This would lead to the creation of an Anglo-Corsican population around the city of Ajaccio, which would still be the most prominent city, acting as an entry port into the country, while Corte would remain as the real administrative capital. In conclusion, while the survival of Corsica as an independent country isn't by itself very impactful to world history, this would mean that Napoleon Bonaparte would have never become a general or emperor of France. This would not only drastically alter European politics, but change the course of world history into an unrecognizable state. Here is the final product.